So Prince William and Catherine just officially, shockingly confirmed that Queen Camilla has been directly, forcefully ordered to permanently vacate Windsor Lodge. And the highly specific way this entire explosive ordeal went down is genuinely significantly stranger and more calculated than most casual observers currently realize. Because for several tense weeks, Camilla was aggressively acting exactly like that historic property was hers forever. She wasn't just temporarily staying there or casually using it for weekends. She was explicitly treating the massive estate exactly like she possessed full, unassailable, permanent ownership. She was unilaterally approving highly expensive structural renovations. She was ruthlessly getting rid of loyal, long-serving staff members. She was actively, arbitrarily restricting exactly which senior family members could even walk through the front doors. And she was confidently presenting the entire sweeping arrangement to her private guests, exactly as if King Charles had just handed her the permanent deeds to the property. And incredibly, absolutely nobody pushed back at her at first. That deafening, terrifying silence from the household gave her the vital room she needed to keep going further and further. But then, Catherine apparently noticed something highly specific that Camilla likely never thought anyone would actually catch. Several deeply personal, highly significant items directly connected to the late Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had suddenly, inexplicably disappeared from the specific, historic rooms where they were absolutely always kept on display. They weren't simply misplaced by cleaning staff, and they certainly weren't being officially claimed by other family members. They had been meticulously wrapped up, carefully labeled, and quietly moved deep into storage under direct, written instructions that traced straight back to Camilla's private office. William absolutely never approved this removal. Catherine was absolutely never consulted about the changes. The wider family wasn't even politely told it was happening until one terrified staff member, who was clearly scared of losing their long-held job, finally bravely broke ranks and said something privately to the Waleses. That one single disclosure changed absolutely everything about the situation. What had initially looked exactly like someone simply, harmlessly redecorating a massive house suddenly looked exactly like someone actively, maliciously trying to completely erase the entire historical identity of Windsor Lodge and aggressively replace it entirely with her own unchecked authority. Historic portraits were quietly moved, traditional guest rooms were entirely reassigned to Camilla's personal friends, and long-standing family arrangements were abruptly canceled, entirely without explanation. Staff members who dared to question the sweeping new orders were coldly told that the residents now answered exclusively to the Queen. Now, before we go any further into this massive fallout, if you're genuinely enjoying this detailed breakdown and you want significantly more royal updates exactly as they happen behind closed doors, please hit that subscribe button and join us here at our channel. It takes just 2 seconds, and it genuinely, greatly helps the channel keep digging into these stories. Okay, let's get into the response. Catherine absolutely didn't explode in anger when she found out about the purges. She did something significantly colder and infinitely more effective. She quietly asked for the official administrative records. Massive storage lists started arriving on her desk, followed by expensive renovation requests, then new, highly restrictive access instructions, and finally, formal written objections from terrified household administrators. And one of those specific, documented warnings clearly, explicitly stated that certain protected historical objects absolutely could not be moved without unanimous, direct family approval. Camilla's office officially received that exact warning in writing. The illicit move went ahead anyway. That is exactly when Prince William got directly, forcefully involved. He discovered that one specific, sealed box placed in storage contained something intimately connected to his mother, Diana, an item he firmly believed was legally protected from removal without his direct, explicit knowledge and consent. And for William, this immediately stopped being a petty, aesthetic disagreement about antique furniture or assigning guest rooms. It instantly became a direct, hostile challenge to his family memory, to rigid palace procedure, and to the absolute limits of Camilla's growing power. He wanted exactly one answer, exactly who gave the final, authorizing order. The damning paper trail absolutely didn't end with some confused, low-level junior aide making a mistake. It led directly, undeniably through Camilla's senior private office, intentionally bypassing two separate, formal written objections and into a clear chain of commands that treated the historic Windsor Lodge exactly like her own personal, unassailable territory. And here is exactly where it gets even messier and significantly more legally dangerous. Official royal resources had been actively, illegally used to pay for expensive structural changes that were absolutely never formally approved by the necessary committees. That specific financial discovery instantly put Camilla in an incredibly dangerous position she absolutely couldn't explain away with mere royal status or ceremony. When an infuriated William finally demanded to see the original binding occupancy documents governing the lodge, palace officials fully expected to find a signed royal grant, a formal lease amendment, or a direct written executive order from King Charles granting her the property. They found absolutely none of those things. What they uncovered instead was a highly conditional, temporary arrangement, one that depended entirely on continuing, unanimous family approval and strictly proper use of the historic property. And buried deep inside the dense legal wording was a highly specific, fatal clause that Camilla's office had apparently absolutely never bothered to read. If the property, the staff, or royal financial resources were ever misused, the entire living arrangement could be instantly, legally withdrawn. By the end of that explosive evening, William and Catherine were absolutely no longer asking whether Camilla had gone too far. They were actively preparing to legally prove that she had. Catherine meticulously placed absolutely every ignored warning, every illicit invoice, every damning storage list, and every canceled access notice into one massive, undeniable file. William formally ordered a full, sweeping internal review of the estate's management. And somewhere deep inside Windsor Lodge, while Camilla continued arrogantly acting exactly like nobody could possibly touch her, palace officials had already started actively examining the exact legal clause that could permanently take the residence completely out of her hands. Catherine's very first instinct upon discovering the mess wasn't loud retaliation. It was strategic containment. She intimately knew exactly how incredibly quickly a private, internal family disagreement could violently become a massive, humiliating public spectacle in the tabloids, and she also knew that King Charles would be agonizingly stuck right in the middle the exact moment Camilla felt publicly cornered. So, she deliberately chose the quiet, diplomatic route first. A message was sent formally requesting a highly private conversation, entirely away from listening staff, away from the flashing cameras, and completely away from the people already actively whispering through the palace corridors. The resulting meeting was incredibly brief and tense. Catherine calmly raised the issue of the missing historical belongings first. She politely explained that several highly significant objects tied directly to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had been completely moved without any required consultation, and that the recent, sweeping staff changes were starting to actively, negatively affect family access to the property. She absolutely didn't yell. She didn't formally accuse. She didn't aggressively threaten. She simply firmly asked for the removals to be immediately paused until William and the Central Household Administration could properly review exactly what had happened. Camilla absolutely did not retreat an inch. According to people intimately familiar with the tense exchange, she responded with the absolute confidence of someone who firmly believed the matter was already completely, permanently settled in her favor. Windsor Lodge, she firmly stated, now fell entirely under her ultimate authority. The staffing decisions were entirely hers to make. The renovations were entirely hers to direct. Catherine, in Camilla's highly dismissive view, should strictly focus on running her own household and completely stop interfering in residential arrangements that absolutely no longer concerned her. That single, arrogant sentence completely changed the temperature of the room and the trajectory of the crisis. Catherine had deliberately, gracefully, approached the conversation specifically to prevent a massive humiliation. Camilla foolishly treated that necessary restraint exactly as weakness. There was absolutely no apology offered for the removed historical possessions, absolutely no concern expressed about the family members affected by the bans, and absolutely no suggestion that anything she had done would be reconsidered. Instead, Catherine was essentially left with a cold warning heavily disguised as a dismissal. Step back, or the situation would become significantly more uncomfortable for everyone. But Catherine absolutely didn't step back. Over the next several tense days, the restrictions at the lodge actually tightened further. A family visit that had been formally approved weeks earlier was suddenly canceled entirely without explanation. Two incredibly loyal, long-serving employees were coldly told their roles were currently under review. A specific guest suite routinely used during earlier, large family gatherings was abruptly reassigned exclusively for Camilla's private, non-royal visitors. New, unfamiliar aides began aggressively checking names at the entrance, even when those specific names belonged to senior family members who had entered the lodge freely and easily for years. The underlying message was entirely unmistakable. Camilla was aggressively building absolute control before absolutely anyone could formally question whether she actually had the legal right to build it. One terrified employee described the atmosphere inside the house as incredibly careful and tense. Staff members completely stopped speaking openly in shared rooms. Sweeping instructions arrived verbally, then were quickly repeated through highly private messages that deliberately vanished from the usual, recorded administrative channels. Some workers obediently obeyed the new rules purely because they deeply feared losing their long-held positions and pensions. Others quietly, bravely began saving copies of the illicit orders. Catherine systematically did the exact same thing. Absolutely every canceled arrangement was meticulously recorded. Every single staffing change was perfectly dated. Every denied request for access was placed directly beside the formal response it received. She gathered massive storage lists, detailed renovation notes, strict security instructions, and the specific names of those explicitly ordered to carry out each change. What had begun as a mere family disagreement was rapidly becoming a devastating, impenetrable legal file. Then, a brave former member of the lodge staff finally came forward with the specific, explosive detail that forcefully pulled Prince William directly, inescapably into the center of the dispute. The expensive renovations were absolutely not being funded solely through Camilla's private, personal office accounts. Official invoices undeniably showed that restricted royal household resources had been actively, illegally used for major structural alterations that had absolutely never received full committee approval. Massive payments had been cleverly attached to incredibly broad maintenance codes, specifically designed to avoid immediate audit attention. Entirely new, luxury furnishings were falsely listed as necessary replacements. Highly decorative, aesthetic work magically appeared under the budget for structural upkeep. Staff members explicitly assigned and paid to perform official state duties were being illegally redirected to solely support Camilla's entirely private, personal arrangements. There was absolutely no longer a mere question of bad interior taste. It was now a massive, legal question of stolen authority and misappropriated funds. When William was finally shown the damning financial records, he absolutely didn't react with the kind of explosive, shouting anger Camilla might have actually expected and prepared for. He became incredibly, terrifyingly quiet. He read absolutely every single page of the file. He asked precisely who had approved the illicit payments, exactly who had reassigned the royal staff, and exactly who had formally authorized the storage of items intimately linked to Diana. Each and every single answer led directly, undeniably back to the exact same place, Camilla's private office. William then formally, legally requested the original, binding papers governing the use of Windsor Lodge. Absolutely not a neat summary, not a quick aids explanation, the actual, signed legal documents. He wanted the absolute ownership record, the specific occupancy terms, the strict funding conditions, and absolutely every single amendment attached to them over the years. Palace administrators frantically began searching the archives. At first, the smug assumption inside Camilla's inner circle was that the review would simply confirm exactly what she had been confidently telling people, that Charles had verbally given her broad, unchecked control, that her position was entirely secure, and that while William might certainly object, he absolutely couldn't reverse anything without openly, publicly challenging the king's authority. Then, an archivist found a single, devastating line buried deep inside the thick residence file. The legal wording absolutely did not describe permanent ownership. It absolutely did not legally grant Camilla an unrestricted, lifetime lease. It explicitly referred to a conditional family arrangement, one that depended entirely on continued, unanimous family approval and strictly proper legal use of the historic property. And directly beneath that line was another massive reference, a completely separate, lethal clause. That specific clause absolutely didn't concern interior decoration. It explicitly concerned gross misuse, unauthorized spending, illegally restricted access, and the absolute unyielding power to instantly withdraw occupancy if the family property was ever treated as personal territory. It was the exact clause that Camilla's office had apparently absolutely never bothered to read. William didn't angrily confront Camilla the exact moment the clause was found. He deliberately waited until the massive residence file had been exhaustively checked against all funding records, all staffing orders, and the specific instructions that moved protected family possessions into storage. He wanted absolutely no gaps in the evidence, absolutely no easy route for denial, and absolutely no room for her to dismiss the massive matter as a simple misunderstanding. By the time the final meeting was formally arranged, he had seen more than enough. Camilla entered the room confidently, believing the discussion would merely be about boring administrative procedure. William instantly made it incredibly clear that it was entirely about her conduct. He placed the damning documents directly in front of her, one by one, in silence. The canceled family visits, the illegally reassigned employees, the fraudulent renovation charges, the arbitrary access restrictions, and the explicit storage order linked directly to Diana's belongings. Then he asked the one question she had desperately avoided, exactly what gave her the right to do this. Camilla absolutely didn't answer with a legal document. She answered purely with status. She haughtily said the residence had been placed entirely at her disposal, the entire household understood her elevated position, and Charles had absolutely no objection to the changes she was making. In her arrogant view, that was more than enough. The king's explicit written approval absolutely didn't need to be sought every single time she replaced a staff member or altered a room. William completely disagreed. He firmly reminded her that Windsor Lodge was absolutely not a private reward. It carried massive family history, incurred official state costs, housed legally protected objects, and involved complex arrangements involving significantly more than one household. A vague verbal understanding from Charles could absolutely not erase strict written legal conditions, nor could it possibly justify moving highly protected possessions connected to his mother entirely without telling him. That was exactly when Camilla abruptly changed her approach. She sharply warned that aggressively pushing the matter further would massively, publicly embarrass Charles. Any messy public dispute over the lodge would easily make it appear to the world that the king completely couldn't control his own family. It would undoubtedly create massive tabloid headlines, deepen existing family tensions, and inevitably invite probing questions about exactly who truly held authority inside Windsor. The warning was highly deliberate and manipulative. William understood the threat perfectly, backed down now, and the family avoided a massive, embarrassing scene. Continue, and he would be entirely blamed for causing one. He continued. William formally ordered a massive, exhaustive review of absolutely every single decision made since Camilla first began treating the lodge as her personal residence. Palace officials were strictly instructed to examine occupancy rules, security logs, staffing changes, all spending, maintenance accounts, guest access logs, and the removal of all belongings. Absolutely nothing would be accepted on her reputation alone. Absolutely every single claim required hard, written proof. Catherine became the absolute organized center of that massive review. She had meticulously preserved all the written objections sent by terrified household administrators. Some explicitly warned that long-serving staff could absolutely not be removed without formal consultation. Others heavily questioned maintenance accounts being drained for private alterations. One specific message explicitly asked Camilla's office to completely delay the transfer of protected family objects until their legal status had been firmly confirmed. The response from her office was incredibly brief and arrogant. Proceed as instructed. That single line completely removed the possibility of claiming innocent confusion. Camilla's office had been explicitly told there were strict limits. It actively chose to ignore them and continue. More damning records followed. A highly restricted security note showed names directly connected to William's household placed on a restricted access list. A staffing memo described historic rooms once entirely reserved for family visits as being under the absolute, exclusive direction of Camilla's private aides. A massive invoice included structural work, requested long before any approval was ever sought. Piece by agonizing piece, the massive pattern became entirely impossible to ignore. This was absolutely not one bad, isolated decision. It was a massive, coordinated system of control. The absolute most revealing evidence came directly from an administrator who had attended an earlier, highly confidential planning meeting. Camilla had reportedly spoken about the lodge exactly as though its future was permanently settled in her favor. She casually discussed entirely new guest arrangements, a massively revised staff structure, and specific rooms that were absolutely no longer available for shared family use. When nervously asked by staff whether permanent written authorization had actually been received for these changes, one aide smugly replied that absolutely nobody would ever dare challenge the Queen. They completely built their massive plan on that incredibly arrogant belief. William's review completely shattered it. By the end of the exhaustive review, officials had reached an undeniable, legal conclusion Camilla absolutely had not prepared for. Her current position at Windsor Lodge was absolutely not protected by legal ownership, a permanent, binding lease, or an unrestricted royal grant. She had merely been permitted to temporarily occupy the residence under extremely strict conditions requiring proper use, shared family access, and deep respect for its historical family purpose. The documents also explicitly, legally, gave the household administration the absolute authority to forcefully intervene when those specific conditions were broken. William requested exactly one final, crucial verification from the lawyers. He desperately wanted absolute confirmation that the withdrawal clause could be legally enforced entirely without Charles signing a brand new order, and entirely without Camilla's consent. The legal answer arrived that very evening. It absolutely could. But another devastating discovery came right along with it. Catherine's meticulously assembled file clearly showed that Camilla had received exactly 3 entirely separate, formal warnings before the massive review even began. Each warning explicitly explained that her authority was conditional. Each warning explicitly asked her to reverse a damaging decision. She arrogantly ignored absolutely all 3. The palace was absolutely no longer deciding whether Camilla had innocently misunderstood the complex arrangement. It was actively deciding exactly what to do about someone who had been explicitly warned, fully understood the massive risk, and arrogantly carried on anyway. The massive file William ordered was absolutely no longer a mere collection of minor concerns. It had become a devastating, undeniable map of exactly how Camilla's absolute control had been ruthlessly built, decision by terrible decision, while absolutely everyone around her falsely assumed someone else had already approved it. Catherine meticulously arranged the material in perfect sequence for the final meeting. First came the altered room plans, then the new staffing schedules, then the illicit storage records. After that came the restrictive instructions given to security, the fraudulent invoices attached to maintenance accounts, and the damning correspondence that clearly showed exactly how staff objections had been handled. Not answered, overruled, ignored. One specific photograph drew William's intense attention immediately. It showed a beautiful, historic sitting room before the alterations began. A second image, taken mere days later, showed the exact same room completely stripped of several priceless family pieces. The expensive replacement furniture had already arrived and been installed. A brand new portrait had been prominently positioned exactly above the mantel. The room absolutely no longer looked shared or historical. It looked completely claimed. That was the entire point. The massive changes were absolutely not random. They followed a highly clear, aggressive design. Camilla's personal guests were always given absolute priority. Her private aides entirely controlled access. Staff loyal to the old household were ruthlessly moved entirely away from key areas. Objects intimately connected to earlier generations were entirely removed from view. Absolutely every single alteration deliberately made the lodge feel significantly less like a shared family residence and vastly more like an extension of her own private, untouchable court. Catherine deeply understood something profound in that moment. Camilla's earlier, cutting remark about Catherine focusing entirely on her own household had absolutely not been spoken in mere frustration. It perfectly reflected a massive plan that was already actively in motion. Catherine and William absolutely were not simply being asked to politely tolerate some new, ugly decoration. They were being aggressively, systematically pushed entirely outside a residence Camilla fully intended to control completely. The absolute strongest, most irrefutable evidence came from a brave, long-serving employee who had remained entirely silent until that exact point. The employee had been physically present when the very first illicit storage instructions were discussed and had anxiously watched deep concern spread among the older, loyal staff. Absolutely nobody wanted to defy the Queen. Absolutely nobody wanted to lose a position held securely for decades. But exactly one specific instruction had felt entirely too serious to ever forget. The employee had secretly kept a copy. It was formally signed. The document explicitly ordered the immediate removal of several highly protected belongings and directly ordered staff to complete the transfer before the very next scheduled family visit occurred. The timing mattered immensely. It proved that the objects were absolutely not moved because of urgent repairs or cleaning. They were moved specifically before William and Catherine could possibly see what was happening. Then, Catherine found the exact warning attached to it. The warning had been officially sent 2 days earlier. It explicitly stated that the listed belongings strictly required consultation and that absolutely no transfer should proceed until ownership and family access had been confirmed. The aggressive instruction to remove them came directly afterward. Camilla's office absolutely knew exactly what they were doing. That massive discovery completely ended the absolute last credible claim that the dispute had simply grown from innocent confusion. The order absolutely had not slipped through an overloaded, busy office by mistake. It had been deliberately issued after the massive risk was explicitly explained in writing. The atmosphere inside the review team completely changed. Officials who had previously remained highly cautious began speaking significantly more directly. The lodge had undeniably been treated as private, untouchable territory. Royal resources had undeniably supported the illicit change. Family access had undeniably been set aside. Still, Camilla's representatives desperately tried exactly one final, weak defense. They claimed Charles had given broad verbal permission for everything. That unverified claim forcefully forced the review into its absolute most sensitive, dangerous stage. Officials meticulously searched for absolutely anything that could possibly support it. A signed letter, a lease amendment, a formal royal warrant, a quick note from the king's private secretary, absolutely even a diary entry confirming that permanent authority had ever been discussed. There was absolutely nothing. Charles may very well have allowed Camilla to use the lodge. That was absolutely not the same thing as legally granting ownership. He may have known she desperately wanted changes. That was absolutely not proof that he explicitly authorized the removal of protected belongings, the fraudulent use of household money, or the strict restriction of family access. Vague words spoken privately could absolutely not erase strict conditions accepted in writing. William then formally asked whether the occupancy could be immediately terminated without creating a massive new constitutional dispute. The legal advisors eagerly returned to the clause and rigidly tested it against absolutely every single action documented in Catherine's massive file. Their conclusion was absolutely firm. The strict conditions had been broken repeatedly, and the household undeniably held the absolute legal power to instantly withdraw the arrangement entirely. William and Catherine calmly approved the next step. A formal, legal notice was prepared. It explicitly listed the numerous breaches, ordered absolutely all unauthorized work to stop immediately, instantly restored total control to the household administration, and explicitly required Camilla's personal staff to leave the residence. There was exactly one final brutal line. The keys absolutely had to be surrendered by a fixed, immovable deadline. When the formal notice reached Camilla, the reaction inside Windsor Lodge was absolutely immediate and chaotic. Doors slammed closed. Frantic calls were made. Staff were strictly told absolutely not to speak to anyone. One arrogant aide loudly insisted the ridiculous decision would be entirely reversed before morning by the king. But morning came. Absolutely nothing changed. The deadline remained. And while Camilla's office frantically searched for absolutely anyone willing to stop it, palace officials were already actively, coldly preparing massive inventories, access orders, and a comprehensive security plan for the handover. For the very first time, the massive question was absolutely no longer whether she would actually leave, but exactly how she would react to being thrown out. The immovable deadline finally arrived under a gray Windsor morning, and the vehicle pulling slowly through the gates absolutely did not belong to Camilla. It carried 2 senior household officials, a high-level security supervisor, and the meticulous inventory team strictly overseeing the handover. Absolutely no photographers waited outside. Absolutely no public announcement had been prepared. The palace desperately wanted the humiliating transfer completed entirely quietly before the rumor hardened into something they couldn't control. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides were frantically moving. Personal files rapidly disappeared from desks. Garment cases were hastily carried down the main staircase. Framed photographs were quickly wrapped in cloth and placed beside heavily labeled boxes. One frantic assistant moved quickly between rooms, desperately checking drawers and cupboards against a private, handwritten list. Another arrogant assistant stood at the entrance, aggressively demanding to know exactly who had authorized the officials to enter before Camilla had even finished speaking with Charles. The cold answer was explicitly contained in the notice. Absolute authority had legally returned entirely to household administration at the exact moment of the deadline. From that exact moment, absolutely no room could be closed to inspection, absolutely no item could leave without being meticulously checked against the inventory, and absolutely no member of Camilla's private staff could remain after the final handover was complete. The officials absolutely didn't argue. They simply read the terms and began their work. That absolute calm made the humiliating scene infinitely worse for Camilla's team. Camilla had fully expected fierce resistance she could easily turn into public outrage. Raised voices would have easily allowed her to loudly claim disrespect. A massive public confrontation would have made William look incredibly reckless and cruel. Instead, absolutely every movement was incredibly measured and cold. Every single box was meticulously logged. Every single doorway was opened under written legal authority. The incredibly sterile process gave her absolutely nothing dramatic or emotional to fight against. Then the very first serious dispute began. A set of highly valuable silver frames had been placed among Camilla's personal effects, but the master inventory explicitly marked them as part of the lodge's historical collection. Her desperate aide loudly insisted they had been personal gifts. The officials calmly asked for any records proving this. Absolutely none were produced, and the highly valuable frames remained. A massive antique writing desk was next, then 2 priceless paintings, then a heavy cabinet containing highly sensitive correspondence from an earlier royal household. Each and every time, the exact same unbreakable rule applied. Strictly personal property could leave, historic family property absolutely could not. Room by agonizing room, the strict boundary Camilla had arrogantly ignored was being completely, ruthlessly restored. William and Catherine were absolutely not present. That was highly deliberate. Their physical absence entirely prevented Camilla from effectively turning the humiliating handover into a massive personal spectacle or a screaming match. Yet, Their absolute authority sat heavily in absolutely every single document resting on the table. Catherine's meticulous records had perfectly established a devastating pattern. William's relentless review had legally activated the termination clause. The Stoic officials now simply carried out the massive decision absolutely neither of them ever intended to reverse. Camilla finally furiously entered the entrance hall right before midday. She was incredibly composed at first. She demanded to see the senior official, aggressively questioned the tight timetable, and firmly stated the residence absolutely could not be surrendered while her highly private discussions with the king were supposedly continuing. The official coldly replied that absolutely any family discussion would absolutely not suspend the legal notice. The deadline had officially passed. The occupancy had officially ended. That was exactly when the intense restraint finally cracked. Camilla furiously accused Catherine of maliciously engineering the entire humiliation from the very beginning. She loudly claimed the legitimate questions about staff and storage had merely been convenient excuses deliberately designed to weaken her massive position and unfairly portray her as a hostile intruder. Then, she turned her immense anger entirely toward William. He was ruthlessly using Diana's memory, she loudly declared, simply to punish absolutely anyone who dared to challenge him. The entire room went completely, terrifyingly still. William's specific response had already been meticulously written into the handover instructions. The removal was absolutely not petty punishment for personal history. It explicitly followed repeated, documented breaches involving access, staffing, fraudulent spending, and highly protected family property. Absolutely no emotional accusation could change the physical, documented record. Camilla vehemently rejected that cold explanation. She aggressively demanded that one specific, highly private sitting room permanently remain sealed until Charles personally decided its status. Her aide stubbornly produced a separate key and completely refused to place it with the others on the table. For several incredibly tense minutes, absolutely everything stopped. The security supervisor carefully checked the formal notice. The senior official completely opened the full, massive occupancy schedule. Absolutely every single room within the massive lodge was explicitly listed. There was absolutely no private exception, absolutely no retained suite, and absolutely no surviving right of access after the termination. The absolute last defense completely collapsed. Camilla was coldly told that keeping the key would legally amount to formally refusing to hand over the property. The official absolutely didn't threaten her. He simply calmly stated exactly what would happen next. Security would forcefully open the room, meticulously document its entire contents, and formally record that the key had absolutely not been surrendered voluntarily. The terrified aide looked toward Camilla. She gave a very small, defeated nod. The final key was placed heavily on the table. By late afternoon, the massive personal vehicles were fully ready. Camilla's disgraced staff left in quiet stages, watched intensely by officials who checked absolutely every package against the master inventory. The final heavy boxes were loaded, the grand entrance hall completely emptied. At the massive gates, one vehicle paused briefly before joining the road entirely away from Windsor. Inside, the profound silence returned. But the palace still had one massive decision left to make. Panicked advisors desperately wanted absolutely no public confirmation of the eviction. They genuinely believed the family could seamlessly describe the abrupt departure as a completely routine, planned change, and simply allow the massive story to slowly fade away. William and Catherine entirely disagreed. Far too many people already intimately knew the truth. Far too many damning records existed. Absolute silence would leave far too much room for another heavily spun version of events. That very evening, they firmly decided to speak, and exactly what they were fully prepared to confirm would make Camilla's humiliating departure absolutely impossible to disguise as a choice. William and Catherine chose their specific words incredibly carefully, but there was absolutely no softness whatsoever in the actual meaning. Camilla had formally vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff absolutely no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been entirely returned. The highly unauthorized work was permanently halted, and the central household administration had completely resumed absolute authority over every single room, account, and access point. The shocking confirmation traveled incredibly quickly. Inside the palace offices, aides completely understood exactly what the public did not. This was absolutely not a voluntary, happy move. It was the direct result of a massive review that ruthlessly exposed exactly how far Camilla had gone, while smugly assuming absolutely nobody would ever challenge her. She had arrogantly treated the residence as permanent. The document explicitly said otherwise. William absolutely didn't celebrate the eviction. He simply ordered the massive restoration to begin immediately. Staff quickly reopened the storage records and meticulously identified absolutely every object illicitly removed during Camilla's aggressive occupation. They painstakingly worked from old photographs, master inventories, and earlier room plans. Items directly connected to Queen Elizabeth were carefully separated from general furnishings. Objects intimately linked to Diana were exhaustively checked against William's own private records before being securely returned. One specific box remained sealed significantly longer than the others. It contained the exact, highly personal item that very first drew William directly into the dispute. The wrapping was completely intact, but the attached label terrifyingly showed it had been scheduled for imminent transfer elsewhere entirely. Had the brave employee not spoken up, the priceless item might have completely disappeared into a significantly wider royal collection far from the lodge, and entirely beyond the notice of those who truly knew its history. Catherine quietly watched the massive restoration without ever turning it into a gloating victory display. For her, the dramatic outcome was absolutely never about simply taking a residence from another woman. It was entirely about drawing an absolute, unshakable boundary. Shared family property absolutely could not be casually claimed through sheer confidence. Sacred family memory absolutely could not be arrogantly cleared from a room simply because it made someone uncomfortable. Absolute authority rigidly required absolute limits, even when the exact person testing them wore a heavy crown. That vital lesson was now permanently written into the historical record. Long-serving, loyal employees who had been brutally removed were contacted immediately. Some were eagerly offered their former positions back. Others were respectfully asked to help entirely rebuild the shattered household structure. Guest arrangements immediately returned to neutral, central control. Private aides completely lost the massive power to decide which family members could enter the property. The massive lodge was absolutely no longer an extension of Camilla's private office. But the massive victory came with immense, lasting damage. Charles now faced incredibly difficult questions he absolutely could not dismiss. Exactly how much had he truly known? Had he quietly approved the expensive renovations? Or had Camilla arrogantly used his name simply because she genuinely believed absolutely nobody would dare ask him directly? Did he fully understand that restricted royal funds had supported entirely private changes? Most importantly, did he intimately know that belongings connected directly to his late mother and Diana had been ruthlessly removed even after written warnings? Absolutely no answer ever came from the king. The deafening silence certainly protected the king, but it absolutely did not protect the trust. William had harshly learned that family assurances were completely useless without hard proof. Catherine had learned that highly private diplomacy could easily be mistaken for weakness. Camilla had brutally learned that massive status could certainly delay consequences, but it absolutely could not erase a legally signed condition once the damning evidence was fully assembled. The fragile balance inside Windsor violently shifted. Staff became incredibly careful about following vague verbal instructions. Administrators strictly demanded written approval for major decisions once comfortably handled through highly private conversations. Security teams exhaustively reviewed exactly who could arbitrarily restrict access to shared residences. Absolutely every single household completely understood the massive message. William and Catherine would fiercely, aggressively challenge absolutely anyone who arrogantly treated royal tradition as personal property. Camilla's forced departure, therefore, became significantly larger than losing one lodge. It explicitly marked the exact moment her immense authority violently met an absolute limit she simply could not move. She had arrogantly believed Charles's immense position would perfectly protect absolutely every decision she made. She had smugly believed Catherine would remain politely silent, William would desperately avoid massive scandal, and terrified staff would simply stay silent. Each and every one of those arrogant beliefs spectacularly failed her. The massive fall was entirely self-inflicted. Had Camilla simply paused after receiving the very first written warning, the dispute might have quietly ended privately. Had she politely restored the belongings, carefully reviewed the spending, or gracefully reopened family access, William may absolutely never have ordered the massive investigation. Instead, absolutely every arrogant refusal added another damning page to Catherine's massive file. Absolutely every attempt to aggressively tighten control only created another willing witness. By the exact time the formal notice arrived, the ironclad case against her had been entirely built by her own arrogant decisions. By nightfall, the completely restored rooms had been thoroughly inspected. The massive lodge was quiet again, but absolutely not with fear. It was the specific, heavy silence that follows a massive, bruising struggle when absolutely everyone finally understands the rules have fundamentally, permanently changed. William and Catherine had absolutely not simply removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had brutally shown her that casually invoking Charles's name would absolutely no longer be enough to protect her, and the very next confrontation may be significantly more serious.